Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. My father didn't slam his fist or raise his voice. He simply slid a cream envelope past the turkey as if passing the salt, but inside wasn't just an eviction notice. It was the opening shot to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars before a deadline just a few days away. What nobody expected was my neighbor walking in with a pie and a sealed envelope, ready to detonate his entire plan. I am Peyton Turner, and for exactly 45 minutes, I was foolish enough to believe that this Thanksgiving might actually survive until dessert. The dining room of my house, the century-old Riverside Craftsman in Wilmington, North Carolina, that I had spent the better part of my late 20s bleeding over, sanding down, and pulling back from the brink of collapse, smelled heavily of roasted sage and melted butter. The antique chandelier cast a warm, forgiving glow over the fine china I had brought out specifically for this occasion. The fire crackled steadily in the restored hearth, throwing dancing shadows against the wainscoting I had painted myself. It was the absolute picture of Southern domestic peace, a perfect, fragile, and utterly pathetic lie. We were roughly halfway through the main course. The soft clinking of silver forks scraping against porcelain was the only sound echoing in the room. I was reaching across the table for my wine glass when my father, Randall Turner, suddenly stopped carving his slice of turkey breast meat. He wiped his mouth meticulously with a linen napkin, folding it into a neat square before placing it beside his plate. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored tweed jacket and withdrew a thick, cream-colored legal envelope. He did not say a single word. He did not slam his fist against the wood or raise his voice to demand my attention. He simply placed his index finger on the very center of the heavy paper and slid it across the polished mahogany table. The envelope glided past the silver gravy boat, bypassed the green bean casserole entirely, and came to a dead, deliberate halt right next to my bowl of mashed potatoes. I stared down at the blank cream paper, a cold knot instantly tightening in my stomach before slowly lifting my gaze to look at the faces surrounding my carefully set table. My mother, Celeste Turner, took a delicate, measured sip of her chilled Chardonnay. As she lowered the crystal glass, she offered me a small, tightly practiced smile. It was the exact same expression she used when returning a defective cashmere sweater to a tired department store clerk, or when informing a hostess that her seating arrangement was unacceptable. It was a smile perfectly engineered by decades of country club politics to make profound cruelty feel like a minor administrative necessity. "You have 10 days to vacate the premises, Peyton," my mother said. Her voice was as smooth, crisp, and chilling as the wine she was drinking. "We wanted to give you the news in person. We felt it was the only decent thing to do for family." Across the table from her sat younger brother, Garrett. He did not flinch when the words left our mother's mouth. He did not offer a fleeting look of apology, nor did he even bother to feign the slight discomfort most normal people would muster when kicking their sister out onto the street during a holiday dinner. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, hooking an arm over the curved wooden backrest. He looked aggressively comfortable. He had the deeply relaxed posture of a man who had cast his deciding vote in a secret boardroom meeting weeks ago and was merely sitting back now to watch the execution play out. He picked up his glass of dark bourbon, swirling the amber liquid over the ice cubes, entirely untroubled by the poison his family was currently pouring into my dining room. I did not scream. I did not throw my glass or ask them what kind of sick, twisted joke this was supposed to be. My hands moved almost mechanically as I picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive cardstock. I broke the waxed seal with my thumb and pulled out the single, sharply folded sheet of paper inside. My eyes tracked the dense paragraphs of capitalized legal jargon, skimming rapidly past the heavy bolded headers. The document referred to me, the woman who had personally replaced every inch of rotten copper wiring in these walls with her own calloused hands and hard-earned paychecks, merely as an occupant without valid ownership rights. It boldly cited severe fatal defects in the property deed transfer from several years prior. It was on the surface an absolute masterpiece of legal intimidation, but they had underestimated me. I had spent too many years dealing with shady contractors, arguing with city permit offices, and navigating the bleak, unforgiving reality of property law to panic blindly at the sight of fancy letterhead. I only needed a 5-second scan of the margins in the footer to see exactly what this paper really was. There was no official court docket number stamped at the top. There was no judge's signature scrolled at the bottom. It was not a court order. It was a piece of cheap extortion disguised as a legal mandate. It was a threat letter drafted by an overly aggressive attorney to manufacture enough shock or to make a weak-willed, terrified person pack their bags and run into the night without asking any questions. I placed the paper face down on the table right next to the remnants of the turkey. I firmly folded my hands together in my lap to physically hide the sudden violent shaking in my fingers, ensuring my vocal cords remained dead calm when I finally spoke. "This is garbage," I said, looking directly into my father's eyes. "And you know it." Randall slowly set his silver fork down on his plate. He leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the table, invading my physical space from across the wood. The patriarchal authority radiating from him was palpable, settling over the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket meant to smother any spark of resistance. "It is a courtesy," my father corrected me, his tone dropping a full octave, settling into a low, growly threat that vibrated in the quiet room. "We are trying our absolute best to handle this matter quietly. If you refuse to cooperate like a mature adult, Peyton, I assure you this will escalate. It will become exceedingly expensive very quickly. It will become a matter of permanent public record. And I promise you it will end up being deeply embarrassing for your reputation in this town. You simply do not have the financial resources to fight us in a prolonged battle. Take the 10 days. Pack your things quietly. Walk away tonight with some shred of dignity before we are forced to bring the authorities here to drag you out of this house." The air in the dining room thickened, turning bitterly cold and suffocatingly heavy. The silence stretched out between us, pulling taut and vibrating right to the absolute breaking point where someone was bound to shatter a wine glass against the wall or start screaming uncontrollably. Then, cutting cleanly through the suffocating tension, the front doorbell rang. It was a sharp, cheerful double chime that echoed loudly through the tense, dead silence of the hallway. The sudden noise startled Garrett so badly he jerked his hand, spilling a dark drop of bourbon directly onto his pristine white cuff. I stood up slowly, pushing my heavy chair back against the hardwood floor with a loud, deliberate scrape that made my mother WSC. I walked out of the dining room without looking back at them, marched down the long hallway, and pulled open the heavy oak front door. Standing on the front porch, bathed in the warm yellow light of the exterior carriage lamp, was my next-door neighbor, Nora Whitfield. Nora was a woman in her late 60s, a formidable retired high school English teacher who missed absolutely nothing in our neighborhood and tolerated even less nonsense. She stood there wearing a thick knitted cardigan to protect against the crisp autumn chill blowing off the river. In her left hand, she carefully balanced a freshly baked pecan pie sitting in a clear glass dish. In her right hand, she gripped a stiff cardboard overnight shipping envelope. She did not offer a polite holiday greeting. She did not smile and ask if she was interrupting our family dinner. She just looked right past my shoulder, her sharp eyes peering down the hallway directly toward the dining room where my family sat, waiting like patient vultures. Then she shifted her gaze back, looking deeply into my eyes. The sharp, utterly knowing gleam in her expression told me instantly, and without a single word, she had guessed exactly what kind of ambush was going down in my house tonight, and she had brought the exact ammunition needed to blow it to pieces. Looking at Nora standing on my front porch, holding that stiff cardboard envelope, a bitter metallic taste flooded the back of my throat. I could feel the presence of my family sitting just a few yards away in the dining room, casually sipping their wine, acting as if they were merely repossessing a borrowed car. They desperately wanted to pretend this house was a sudden windfall I had somehow swindled from them. They wanted to rewrite our entire history to justify their ambush. But this house did not fall out of the clear blue sky into my lap. I paid for every single square foot of it with sweat, panic attacks, and the best years of my youth. Let me take you back exactly 7 years. This property originally belonged to my great-aunt Lorraine Turner. Towards the absolute end of her life, she was a fiercely independent, a physically frail woman living entirely alone in a structure that was slowly, inevitably collapsing around her. 3 devastating hurricane seasons in a row had battered the Carolina coast. The river had crested its banks twice, sending muddy, foul-smelling water sweeping through the crawl space, soaking the insulation and rotting the original pine floorboards from the bottom up. The roof leaked relentlessly into the upstairs hallway every time it rained for more than 2 hours. Did my father ever drive down from Raleigh to patch her roof? Absolutely not. Did my mother ever offer to hire a professional cleaning service to scrub the toxic black mold creeping up the baseboards in the guest bathroom? Not a chance. Did my brother ever lift a single finger to help the elderly woman who used to slip $50 bills into his birthday cards? He did not even bother to return her frantic phone calls when the furnace died in the middle of January. They all collectively decided Lorraine was a lost cause, a stubborn old woman who should be shoved into a cheap state-run facility so they could quietly sell off the lot to the highest bidder. The moment she passed away, I refused to let her die in a sterile room surrounded by strangers. I resigned from a highly competitive, lucrative corporate logistics job up in Charlotte. I packed up my entire life into a rented moving truck and drove back down to Wilmington. I took a massive pay cut to accept a position as a purchasing manager for Harbor Ridge Systems, a local maritime supply company. It was the only way I could be physically close enough to actually keep Lorraine alive and keep her home standing for over 4 years. My life was a brutal, unrelenting cycle. I worked 45 hours a week at Harbor Ridge, aggressively negotiating shipping contracts and managing chaotic supply chains. Then I would drive straight to the riverside. My nights and my weekends were not spent at downtown bars or Sunday brunches with friends. They were spent wearing a heavy dust mask and scratch safety goggles. Let me be perfectly clear about one critical fact. Lorraine did not just hand me the deed out of blind, sentimental favoritism. She was a woman of severe old-school principles. She hated the idea of charity even from her own blood. So, we sat down at her scarred kitchen table with a local real estate attorney and drew up an ironclad care agreement, coupled with a strict lease-to-own option. The terms were brutally clear and legally binding. If I physically maintained the property, covered all the urgent out-of-pocket repair costs, paid her property taxes, and stayed to care for her until the very end of her natural life, I would earn the exclusive right to purchase the estate. The final purchase price was locked in at the exact amount of the remaining mortgage debt and the acred municipal liens. It was not a gift. It was a second full-time job that nearly broke me. I drained my personal savings account down to the absolute bottom to pay for a brand new architectural shingle roof. I spent thousands of dollars hiring a master electrician to rip out the terrifying arcade knob and tube wiring that threatened to burn the entire place down every time we plugged in a space heater. I spent my lunch break sitting in the fluorescent-lit city permitting office, aggressively arguing with bureaucratic clerks about historic zoning variances. I fought screaming matches with lazy, dishonest contractors who tried to overcharge a young woman acting as her own project manager. I hauled heavy sheets of drywall up the narrowed staircase until my shoulders itched so badly I could barely lift my arms to wash my hair in the morning. I accepted the bone-deep exhaustion because every hammered nail and every freshly painted wall was a promise kept to the only family member who actually saw me as a human being. When Lorraine finally passed away quietly in her sleep, holding my hand, the brief mourning period was immediately interrupted by harsh legal realities. I did not inherit the house, executed my contractual right to buy it. I went to a local bank, sat down with a loan officer, and legally borrowed the money to pay off Lorraine's remaining debts. I filed every single piece of complex paperwork required by the county clerk. I became the legitimate registered owner through a verified, heavily documented financial transaction. And my father knew this. He knew every single microscopic detail. During the probate process, the estate attorney required all potential heirs to sign off. Randall Turner himself had sat in a plush leather chair in a downtown law office and signed a sworn notarized affidavit. He legally acknowledged that Lorraine was of perfectly sound mind when she made our agreement. He signed his own name in blue ink, formally confirming that I had fully satisfied my end of the bargain, and possessed the absolute legal right to complete the purchase without any future contestation. Gary, however, never swallowed that pill. My younger brother had spent his entire 20s and early 30s bouncing from one disastrous get-rich scheme to the next. He lost thousands backing a failed artisan vape shop. He lost tens of thousands on a shady cryptocurrency trading platform that vanished overnight. He always viewed Elrain's riverside property as his ultimate safety net, the magical unearned inheritance that would miraculously wipe out his massive debts and fund his next grand delusion. He genuinely believed that simply being the only male heir meant the universe inherently owed him prime real estate. For a few years, his resentment was just a low, pathetic simmer. He would make passive-aggressive comments at family holidays about how nice it must be to get a free house. I ignored him, too busy actually paying my monthly mortgage and fixing plumbing leaks to care about his bruised ego. But then the landscape of our sleepy riverside neighborhood began to drastically shift. A massive, heavily funded commercial redevelopment project started quietly buying up the adjacent abandoned industrial lots. Corporate developers started floating public plans for luxury waterfront condominiums, artisan coffee shops, and high-end boutique retail spaces. Almost overnight, the property values in our zip code skyrocketed. The crumbling, forgotten neighborhood Lorraine had stubbornly clung to was suddenly the most coveted stretch of dirt in the entire county. That was the primary catalyst. The exact moment my family realized the ground beneath my carefully restored home was suddenly worth a small fortune. Garrett's old pathetic bitterness violently mutated. It crystallized into a sharp, hyper-focused and incredibly dangerous greed. They no longer saw a century-old house that required a new HVAC system and constant, exhausting maintenance. They saw a winning lottery ticket that had been unfairly handed to the wrong child. They conveniently forgot the miserable years I spent scraping toxic black rot out of the window frames. They completely erased the terrifying nights I slept on a deflated air mattress next to Lorraine's hospital bed, staying awake just to listen to her breathe. They only saw the newly appraised dollar signs attached to the latest property tax assessment. And in their minds, family loyalty was entirely conditional, easily erased the very moment the potential profit margin became high enough to completely justify the betrayal. Nora did not pull out a chair to join us. She walked straight past my mother's empty, polite nod and ignored the heavy, suffocating hostility radiating from my father. She carried the glass pie dish to the antique wooden sideboard, setting it down safely away from the battlefield of the dining table. Then she stepped right up to the edge of the polished mahogany, holding the stiff cardboard envelope. She did not toss it. She placed it down with a deliberate, heavy thud, resting it exactly 1 inch away from the fabricated eviction notice my father had just tried to use as a weapon. "Darius Flint had Curria drop this at my porch roughly 1 hour ago," Nora announced. Her voice was steady, projecting the kind of absolute, uncompromising authority she used to command a room full of rowdy high school seniors. "He knew you would be sitting down to dinner with your guests. He asked me to ensure you received it the moment they tried to make their move." Darius Flint was the bulldog of a real estate attorney who handled my title insurance policy. He was a man who communicated strictly through verified facts, registered deeds, and ironclad contracts. I reached out, my fingers entirely steady now, and pulled the tier strip on the cardboard. I slid out a neatly clipped stack of heavy premium legal paper. These were not cheap intimidation tactics typed up by a desperate associate. These were registered county-stamped realities. I peeled the first page back and laid it flat on the wood. It was a certified copy complete, with the raised embossed seal of the county clerk pressed into the bottom corner. I recognized the document instantly. It was the sworn affidavit my father had executed during the final agonizing days of the probate settlement. I used my index finger to slowly slide the document across the table, making sure it stopped right in front of his pristine dinner plate. There, undeniable in stark black ink, was his own signature. It was a legally binding oath. He had sworn under extreme penalty of perjury that I possessed the sole undisputed right to finalize the property transaction. He had sworn on the legal record that no other living relative, including himself or his son, retained any valid claim, interest, or right of possession to the premises. It was a complete and total waiver of rights. But the second document in the stack was infinitely more damaging. I unclipped it and placed it right next to the affidavit. It was a finalized settlement ledger from the estate. This page proved that his waiver was not an act of fatherly grace. It was a purchased commodity. The ledger detailed a very specific, cleared financial transaction. Randall had accepted a lump sum payout of $45,000 from the estate's remaining liquid assets. The condition of that payout was explicitly written in bold, unforgiving print. The funds were dispersed in direct exchange for his permanent, irrevocable surrender of any current or future claims against my home. He had literally cashed a massive check to walk away forever. And now he was sitting in my dining room eating my food, trying to steal the exact same asset he had already been paid to ignore. The third and final piece of paper was printed on the official watermarked letterhead of my national title insurance underwriter. It was a formal notice of adverse action. I read the paragraphs aloud, letting my voice carry the cold, undeniable weight of the corporate mandate. The letter stated clearly that because Randall had recently initiated hostile inquiries and aggressive claims against a title he had previously sworn was clear, the underwriter was officially opening a title fraud investigation against him. Furthermore, the letter outlined the immediate consequences. Until the fraud investigation concluded, the insurance company was executing an immediate hard freeze on the $75,000 in escrow reserve funds that were scheduled to be released to my parents at the end of the fiscal year. They had tried to bluff me out of my house, and in doing so, they had triggered a financial tripwire that locked up their own money. My mother's tightly practiced smile finally cracked, shattering like cheap glass. The muscles in her jaw tightened, pulling the skin taut around her cheekbones. "Pattern, darling, this is completely unnecessary and incredibly dramatic," Celeste said, her voice dropping its sweet, aristocratic lilt and taking on a sharp metallic edge of panic. She folded her hands tightly on the table. "We are simply trying to discuss basic family fairness. Your brother needs a foundation, and we felt this has absolutely nothing to do with fairness." Celeste Nora cut in. She did not shout, but the sheer freezing certainty in her tone silenced my mother instantly. "This is a matter of who is telling the truth on legally binding paper, and who is actively contradicting their own sworn testimony to commit financial extortion." Garrett lunged forward, nearly knocking over his crystal water goblet. The lazy, aggressively arrogant posture he had maintained all evening vanished in a split second. He snatched the stack of papers from the table, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal paragraphs. For the very first time since he swaggered into my home, he looked genuinely, viscerally terrified, the smug color completely drained from his face as his eyes locked onto the words fraud investigation and frozen reserves. He looked up at our father, his mouth slightly open, the paper trembling slightly in his grip. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He finally understood that his father's aggressive little eviction bluff had just detonated in their faces. Randall had not secured him a free house. Randall had just exposed the entire family to massive financial ruin and potential criminal liability. I did not feel the urge to scream at them. I did not feel the hot, blinding rush of anger that usually accompanies family betrayal. I felt an absolute freezing calm wash over my entire body. I had won the war before they even realized the battlefield had shifted. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, mirroring the exact aggressive posture my father had taken just 10 minutes prior. I looked straight across the roasted turkey, past the glowing candles, directly into his eyes. He was staring at the title underwriter letter like it was a live grenade. "If you took the estate's money," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision, "and if you signed a sworn oath under penalty of perjury, acknowledging you had zero legal rights to be here, why did you dare bring that pathetic piece of garbage into my home and place it on my dinner table?" Randall opened his mouth, but his normally booming voice completely failed him. Only a dry, pathetic, stuttering sound came out. He looked to his left at Celeste, then to his right at Garrett, desperately searching for a lifeline, a loophole, or an excuse that simply did not exist. He tried to compose his face into a mask of righteous patriarchal indignation, but his jaw was visibly trembling. He was a man utterly destroyed by his own signature before he could finally string a single coherent lie together to defend himself. Nora delivered the first true crushing blow of the evening. "I called Darius Flint 2 days ago," Nora said, crossing her arms tightly over her knitted cardigan and staring Randall down with absolute contempt, "because I was out walking my dog, Randall, and I saw you sitting in your least luxury sedan parked at the end of our block. Your window was rolled down. I stood behind the oak tree and listened as you made very frantic phone calls to 3 different local locksmiths and a moving company asking for advice on the fastest way to force a relative into a property before the weekend. You tipped your hand to the neighborhood watch and I handed your entire playbook straight to the lawyers. I looked at the fake eviction notice still lying near my plate. I finally understood its true purpose. Randall had never intended to drag me into a legitimate courtroom. A real lawsuit over a contested deed would take months, possibly years of grueling discovery and expensive litigation. Developers like Seagrass Row did not wait years. They wanted clean land, and they wanted it immediately. "The deadline," I said out loud, my voice sounding distant to my own ears as the terrifying reality washed over me. "There is a deadline attached to that assembly bonus, isn't there?" Moore nodded grimly. "Monday morning, first thing after the Thanksgiving holiday weekend, the developers have a physical site inspection scheduled for 9:00. They need visual confirmation that the footprint is either entirely vacant or under unquestionable unified family control before they wire the acquisition funds into escrow." It was a blitzkrieg tactic. They knew I was a single woman living alone. They assumed I would be emotionally fragile during the holiday. The plan was violently simple. Ambush me at the dinner table, drop a terrifying official-looking legal threat in my lap, and create so much psychological chaos that I would simply pack a suitcase and flee to a hotel just to escape the shouting. If they could just get me out of the physical building for 48 hours, they would instantly change the locks. They would board up the windows. And come Monday morning, Garrett would stand on my front porch, shake hands with the corporate suits from Seagrass Row, and confidently assure them that his difficult sister had agreed to a private buyout. He would tell them the house was empty, the family was united, and the deed transfer was a mere administrative formality that would be smoothed over by their father's fictional authority. By the time I realized I had been locked out of my own legally purchased home, the corporate machinery would already be in motion and I would be fighting a billion-dollar development firm instead of just my greedy brother. I slowly turned my head and looked at my mother. Celeste was sitting perfectly still, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles were bone white. I remembered the exact words she had used just a few minutes ago. She had called this a matter of basic family fairness. She had said Garrick just needed a proper start. She had not drafted the fake legal notice. She had not made the panicked phone calls to the locksmiths. But she was the glossy, aristocratic paint slapped over a rotting foundation. She knew. She knew every single detail of this extortion plot. She knew her son stood to pocket hundreds of thousands of dollars by throwing her daughter out onto the street, and she had agreed to play the role of the calm, reasonable matriarch to help push me out the door faster. She was supposed to be the soothing voice of compromise that convinced me to surrender my greatest achievement so her favorite child could cover his bad debts. The sheer scale of the betrayal was breathtaking. It was a massive coordinated conspiracy executed by the people who were supposed to protect me. "You were going to steal it," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "You were going to steal my home and sell it to a wrecking crew by Monday. Peyton, please. You have to understand the market dynamics at play here." Garrett suddenly stammered, desperately trying to salvage his shattered leverage. "The neighborhood is changing. You cannot stop progress. They are offering a premium far above the assessed value. We could have split the profits. I was going to cut you in once the dust settled. You would have walked away with a massive return on your investment. Do not insult my intelligence," I snapped, my voice finally cracking like a whip across the room. If you intended to cut me in, you would have brought me a legitimate commercial purchase offer. You would not have brought me a fraudulent eviction notice and a fake smile. The silence that descended on the room this time was different. It was no longer the tense silence of an impending argument. It was the dead, hollow silence of a collapsed scheme. They were exposed. Every lie, every forged document, every hidden motive was laid bare under the harsh light of the dining room chandelier. But as I watched my father clench his jaw and my brother nervously tap his fingers against his knee, a new, much darker realization began to take root in my mind. The deadline was Monday. It was currently Thursday night. A normal person caught in a massive fraud would apologize, retreat, and hope I did not press criminal charges. But my family was not normal. They were desperate. Garrett owed money he did not have. Randall had already spent a payout he was about to lose. They had promised a massive corporate entity a piece of land they did not control. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were dangling just out of their reach, and the only thing standing between them and financial salvation was me. If the corporate inspection was scheduled for Monday morning, they could not afford to simply walk away and lick their wounds. The Thanksgiving ambush had failed spectacularly, but the weekend had only just begun. They still had 3 full days to force me out. And now that the polite, passive, aggressive mask had been violently ripped off, they had absolutely no reason to hold back. They were not going to stop. The real war was not over. It had not even truly begun. As I watched the 3 of them sitting completely frozen at my table, their eyes darting between the irrefutable evidence and the front door, I knew with absolute terrifying certainty that they were going to come back, and next time they would not bother bringing a piece of paper. They would bring force. The departure was completely soundless, save for the heavy scrape of chair legs against the wood and the sharp click of the front door latch. They did not utter a single parting word. There were no apologies, no final threats, just the toxic, suffocating silence of a defeated retreat. I stood in the hallway, listening to the heavy engine of my father's least luxury sedan roar to life and fade down the quiet residential street. Once the house was truly empty of their presence, I walked back into the dining room. I looked at the half-eaten turkey, the congealing gravy, and the scattered legal papers. A younger, more fragile version of myself might have collapsed into one of the antique chairs and wept until my lungs burned. I might have swept the fine china off the mahogany surface in a blind fit of rage, screaming at the unfairness of it all. I did absolutely none of those things. The time for emotional reactions had officially expired. This was no longer a family dinner. It was a contested asset zone. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Darius Flint. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and completely devoid of any holiday lethargy. "They are gone," I said, my voice shockingly steady, devoid of any tremble. "Did they take the bait?" Darius asked, his tone shifting immediately into business mode. "They choked on it." Garrett looked like he was going to be physically sick. "But they are desperate." "Darius, the developer deadline is Monday morning. They are not going to just walk away and let that money disappear." "Then we are officially on a war footing," Darius replied. "Listen to me very carefully. Do not throw anything away. Leave the dining room table exactly as it is right now. Take higher-resolution photographs of everything from multiple angles. The placement of the fake eviction notice, the envelopes, the entire setup. We are establishing a timeline of documented harassment. I need you to pull up your digital archives immediately. Print out the original care agreement you made with L. Rain. Print the registered property deed. Print the final wire transfer confirmation from the bank and your current title insurance policy." I paced the length of the hallway, my mind shifting into a cold, hyper-focused state of operational control. "I have hard copies of all of those in my fireproof safe in the study." "Excellent. Keep them on your person or right by the front door. Now, here is what you need to anticipate," Darius continued, his tone dropping into a serious, instructive cadence. "They are not going to try and sue you. They do not have the time for a protracted legal battle. They are going to attempt what we call a civil standby. It is a psychological pressure tactic. Garrett will likely show up tomorrow morning with a local sheriff's deputy, a locksmith, or perhaps even a commercial moving crew." I stopped pacing, my hand resting against the cool plaster of the wall. A deputy. How can he bring the police without a valid court order? Because he will lie to the dispatcher, Darius explained flatly. He will claim there is a domestic dispute over a shared family property and request an officer to keep the peace while he retrieves his belongings or accesses his portion of the residence. The police will not be there to physically evict you. They will be there strictly to prevent a physical altercation, but Garrett will use the badge standing behind him to intimidate you into stepping aside or handing over a key. It is entirely performative, designed to make you panic, doubt your own legal standing, and surrender possession. I will not panic, I stated firmly. I know you will not, Darius said. But you must understand their ultimate goal. The absolute worst-case scenario is not a forced violent break-in. It is them staging a scene that looks legitimate enough to make a responding officer or a neighborhood witness hesitate for 5 minutes. If they can manufacture a situation that resembles a messy but consensual family living arrangement, it creates a gray area. And in real estate disputes, a gray area is enough to delay an injunction and ruin the clarity of our legal defense. You cannot give them a single inch of ambiguity. They need to look like trespassers, not tenants. After I'd ended the call, Nora and I began a methodical, silent sweep of the property. We did not speak much. The situation demanded immediate action over comforting conversation. The autumn air was biting, carrying a sharp scent of the river. As we stepped off the back porch and walked the perimeter of the fenced yard, we checked the heavy iron gate, ensuring the padlock was securely fastened. We tested the ground floor window latches one by one. Then we both stopped and stared at the detached studio apartment sitting at the far rear edge of the property lying near the alleyway. It was a small converted carriage house I had painstakingly renovated 3 years ago. It had its own separate gravel pathway leading from the back alley, its own independent plumbing, and a heavy solid core wooden door with a separate deadbolt. This is the vulnerability, Nora said, pointing a finger at the darkened structure. It is physically disconnected from your primary living space. If they want to fabricate a story about Garrett having his own separate residential unit, this is the only place they can do it without having to physically break through your front door and commit a blatant burglary. She was exactly right. It was the perfect isolated target for a manufactured Tenny claim. We moved quickly. I went back into the main house and brought out my laptop and an aluminum stepladder. We spent the next 2 hours repositioning the exterior security cameras. I angled one wide lens to cover the entire length of the back alley and focused a secondary hide camera directly on the studio door. I synced the system to the main application on my phone, cranking the motion sensor sensitivity to its absolute maximum setting. I wanted a loud, jarring alert on my screen if a stray leaf blew across the gravel path. Inside the house, I followed Darius's instructions to the exact letter. I opened the heavy steel safe in my home office and pulled out the thick organized manila folders containing my life's work. I made 2 separate, perfectly collated stacks of the critical documents. One stack went onto the kitchen island for quick reference. The other I placed on the entryway console table right next to the front door, weighted down by a heavy decorative brass compass. If anyone knocked, I would not have to ask them to wait while I dug through filing cabinets in a panic. The irrefutable proof of my sole ownership would be the very first thing they saw. By the time Nora finally went back to her own house, assuring me she would keep her phone off silent mode, the digital clock on the microwave glowed past 11:30 at night. I was physically exhausted, my muscles aching from the tension. Yet my brain was firing rapidly, processing every possible angle of attack my family might utilize. I sat down at the kitchen island, nursing a glass of cold tap water, and opened my laptop to check my email. I wanted to ensure Darius had received the photographs of the dining room table, but buried beneath a pile of promotional holiday sales and spam, there was an automated confirmation message from a major regional internet service provider. My stomach tightened into a hard knot. The email address the message had been sent to was a slight, very common misspelling of my own address, an error that fortunately redirected it to my server's catch-all inbox instead of bouncing back. I clicked open the message. It was a scheduled installation appointment for fiber optic internet service. The service address listed was my exact property, including the specific unit designation of the back studio, but the recipient name was not mine. It was registered under a limited liability company I instantly recognized from Garrett's past failed business ventures. He had actually tried to set up utility services at my home. It was a digital paper trail deliberately designed to prove long-term residency. He was systematically building a fake life on my property, piece by piece, hoping to generate enough official-looking mail and service records to trick a judge, a police officer, or a corporate inspector into believing he legally lived and operated a business here. I took a clear screenshot of the confirmation email, forwarded it directly to Darius with an urgent flag, and slowly closed the laptop. The sheer calculated audacity of the maneuver was chilling. They were not just improvising out of desperate anger. They had been meticulously planning this forced occupation for weeks. They had mapped out the legal loopholes, anticipated the burden of proof, and built a fraudulent narrative from the ground up, treating my home like a hostile takeover target. But as I sat alone in the quiet house I had saved and rebuilt with my own two hands, a profound, icy sense of clarity washed over me. I finally understood the rules of engagement. I understood exactly what they needed to succeed, and more importantly, I knew exactly how to deny it to them when they inevitably returned. I would not yell. I would not argue about fairness, family history, or broken promises. I would not block the doorway with my physical body or threaten to call the authorities immediately. Arguing with them would only feed their narrative of a petty, disorganized domestic dispute. Instead, I made a conscious tactical decision. I would let them cross the line. I would let Garrick bring his locksmith. I would let my father attempt his grand deception. I would stand back, perfectly calm and completely silent, and allow them to take one more arrogant step forward. I would let them push the boundaries of their scheme far enough that their actions crossed the threshold from a civil family disagreement into a documented, undeniable criminal act. They thought they were dealing with a terrified, emotional daughter. They were about to find out that they were dealing with the architect of their own ruin. I was not going to stop them from digging their own grave. I was just going to wait until they were deep enough to hand them the shovel. The violent buzzing of my phone shattered the early morning quiet. It was exactly 6:45 on Saturday morning. I had not slept. I was sitting at the kitchen island, staring at the live feed of my security cameras. A small rented box truck pulled up to the curb in front of my house. 4 doors slammed shut in rapid succession. The high-definition screen illuminated the players of my brother's desperate theatrical production. Barrett stepped onto my front walkway. He was not alone. Walking beside him was a uniformed county sheriff's deputy, his hand resting casually near his heavy utility belt. Trailing slightly behind them was a man wearing a canvas-work jacket carrying a heavy steel toolbox, a locksmith. 2 men in moving company windbreakers stood by the truck holding 2 medium-sized cardboard moving boxes filled with what looked like men's clothing and sports equipment. This was the civil standby Darius had predicted. It was a physical manifestation of intimidation designed to overwhelm my senses and force a surrender before I could even process the legal reality of the situation. I picked up the thick manila folder I had prepared the night before and walked down the hallway. I did not pause to check my reflection or take a deep, steadying breath. I unbolted the heavy oak door and pulled it wide open before they could even press the doorbell. Garrick flinched, clearly startled by my immediate appearance. He addressed the part of a frustrated but reasonable tenant, wearing a crisp button-down shirt and a calm manufactured expression. "Good morning, ma'am," the deputy said. He stepped forward, establishing himself as the buffer. His tone was professional, weary, and entirely neutral. "I am Deputy Miller. I am not here to execute an eviction or force anyone off the premises. I am strictly here on a civil standby to keep the peace while your brother retrieves access to his leased portion of the property. I am not trying to take over the main house, Peyton," Garrett interjected smoothly, raising his hands in a gesture of false surrender. He looked at the deputy playing the role of the exhausted sibling perfectly. "We have an internal family agreement. I only need access to the detached back studio. I have a binding lease, and she changed the locks on me after a minor family disagreement over the holiday." I did not look at Garrett. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Deputy Miller. I handed him the first document from my folder. "Good morning, Deputy," I said, my voice projecting a cold, flat certainty that immediately contrasted with Burritt's nervous energy. "I am the sole legal owner of this entire parcel, including all detached structures. Here is the recorded warranty deed, the finalized purchase agreement, and my stat-issued identification. There are no tenants on this property. There are no leases. This man is attempting to use your presence to bypass a legal title dispute." The deputy took my paperwork, his brow furrowing as he scanned the raised county seals and the clear, unambiguous language of the deed. "I have the lease right here," Garrett snapped, his calm facade cracking slightly as he shoved a stapled packet of paper toward the officer. "It grants me exclusive use of the rear alley entrance and the studio apartment for a term of 24 months. Deputy Miller held my deed in his left hand and took Garrett's packet in his right. I leaned in slightly to look at the document my brother was aggressively waving around. It was a standard internet downloaded residential lease template, but at the bottom of the second page, resting on the signature line, was my name. It was a remarkably good forgery if you only glanced at it for a second. The loops and the slant mimicked my handwriting perfectly, but I knew the precise pressure I applied to the pen when crossing my letters, and the ink on that page lacked the heavy, deliberate indentation I always left behind. More importantly, I knew I had never sat in a room and signed my property away to a man who had never paid a legitimate bill in his entire adult life. "That is a forged signature on a fraudulent document," I stated, loud enough for the locksmith standing on the steps to hear. "Perfectly. If you attempt to use that piece of paper to drill through my deadbolt, I will press felony charges for breaking and entering, and I will include anyone who assists you in that police report." The locksmith, a burly man with a graying beard, immediately froze. He looked at Garrett, then looked at the heavy oak door, and finally looked at the incredibly calm homeowner holding a stack of certified county records. He did not need a law degree to understand the immense liability he had just walked into. "Whoa, hold on a minute," the locksmith said, taking 2 large steps backward down the brick stairs. He set his heavy steel toolbox down on the walkway with a loud clank. "I was told this was a simple lockout for a verified tenant. I do not touch contested properties. I do not drill locks when the person holding the deed is standing right in front of me threatening a felony. You people need to take this to a civil judge. I am out of here." He turned around and started walking back to his service van without waiting for an argument. Garrett panicked. The physical force he had brought to intimidate me was suddenly evaporating. "He has a signed lease. You have to let him open the door," he yelled at the deputy. "Sir, lower your voice," Deputy Miller commanded, taking a step back to create space. "As I stated clearly when we arrived, I am only here to keep the peace. I am not a judge. I cannot verify the authenticity of a contested signature on a porch on a Saturday morning, since the homeowner is present with a recorded deed and explicitly denies your tenancy. I cannot allow a forced entry." Just as Burritt opened his mouth to escalate the argument, a sleek black sedan pulled sharply up to the curb, parking directly behind the sheriff's cruiser. The heavy door swung open and Darius Flint stepped out onto the asphalt. He was wearing a sharp tailored suit despite the early hour, and he carried a sleek leather briefcase that looked significantly more intimidating than the locksmith's toolbox. Darius did not rush. He walked up the concrete path with the measured, terrifying confidence of a predator who had already cornered his prey. "Deputy Miller, I am Darius Flint, legal counsel for the homeowner," he announced, projecting his voice clearly across the lawn. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. "I believe Mr. Turner has conveniently failed to provide you with the complete legal context of his presence here today." Darius handed the deputy 2 pieces of heavy stuff. The first document is a sworn notarized affidavit signed by this man's own father during a probate settlement, legally waiving any and all family claims to this specific property. The second is a formal notice from a national title insurance underwriter confirming that an active fraud investigation was launched yesterday afternoon regarding the Turner family's coordinated attempts to fabricate a claim on this exact estate. Deputy Miller read the bold header of the fraud investigation notice. His posture instantly shifted from a neutral mediator to a law enforcement officer recognizing a potential scam. He looked at Garrett with a hardened, intensely skeptical glare. "You brought me out here on a civil standby while you are under active investigation for title fraud?" the deputy asked, his voice dripping with sudden cold irritation. The walls were rapidly closing in on Garrett. The carefully constructed narrative of the misunderstood, displaced brother was disintegrating in the crisp morning air. He was losing the studio. He was losing the police escort. And he was rapidly running out of time before the Monday morning deadline. Under the crushing pressure of Darius's arrival and the deputy's shifting allegiance, Garrett's discipline completely shattered. He stopped trying to play the victim and reverted to the desperate, entitled panic that had driven this entire scheme. "This is ridiculous," Garrett shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the back of my property. He was no longer talking about family fairness or minor disagreements. "I just need to get into the exact part promised to me. The development company needs the back half cleared by Monday. If I do not have access to that studio today, the entire assembly deal falls apart and I lose the broker fee. You are ruining everything for a miserable piece of dirt." The moment the words left his mouth, a dead silence fell over the front porch. Garrett froze, his eyes widening as he realized exactly what he had just confessed out loud in front of a sworn law enforcement officer. He had not just admitted that the eviction was a lie. He had explicitly confirmed that the entire confrontation was a premeditated, coordinated business maneuver designed to illegally secure property for a third-party corporate transaction before a specific financial deadline. It was no longer a messy family misunderstanding. He had just verbally confessed to attempted commercial fraud. The heady silence that followed my brother's accidental confession on the front porch was abruptly shattered by a sharp, vibrating hum against my thigh. I reached into the pocket of my jeans and pulled out my phone. The screen was brightly illuminated with a push notification from the security application I had fiercely calibrated just hours prior. It was not the front door camera. It was the secondary lens, the one Nora and I had specifically angled to cover the narrow shadowed stretch of the back alley leading directly to the detached carriage house. I tapped the alert, expanding the live video feed across my screen. The high-definition night vision had automatically switched off in the morning light, revealing a perfectly clear full-color broadcast of my father. Randall was not sitting safely in his luxury sedan, waiting for his son to secure the property. He was standing on the gravel path right outside the solid core door of my studio apartment. He was wearing heavy leather work gloves and clutching a bright yellow heavy-duty cordless power drill in his right hand. I did not gasp. I simply turned my phone screen around and held it up directly in front of Deputy Miller's face. "Deputy," I said, my voice cutting through the crisp morning air with absolute chilling authority. "While this man is standing on my front porch wasting your time with a forged document, his accomplice is actively attempting to breach the rear of my property. We need to walk around to the alleyway right now." Deputy Miller took one look at the live video feed, his jaw tightening instantly. The lingering patience of a civil mediator vanished from his posture, replaced immediately by the rigid, alert stance of a law enforcement officer responding to an active property crime. He unclicked his radio from his belt, rested his right hand firmly on his utility belt, and gestured for me to lead the way. We moved as a swift, silent unit. I marched down the front brick steps, cutting sharply across the damp morning grass of the side yard. Darius Flint followed closely behind me, his leather briefcase clutched tightly against his side. The deputy took up the rear, effectively trapping a deeply panicked Garrett between us. My brother stumbled over his own feet, his breathing turning ragged as he realized the distraction play had catastrophically failed. The crunch of our shoes against the loose gravel of the back alley was loud enough to echo against the wooden fence panels. We rounded the sharp corner of the main house and stepped into the clear, unobstructed view of the carriage house entrance. My father froze completely. The loud mechanical whine of his cordless drill died instantly. He had the steel bit pressed directly against the historic wooden siding of my building right next to the door frame. At his feet sat a massive heavy-duty cardboard moving box, the top flaps thrown wide open to reveal a meticulously curated collection of physical lies. He was not simply trying to force the lock to let Garrett inside. He was trying to forcibly alter the legal reality of the structure. In his left hand, resting against the wall he was about to puncture, was a brand new matte black metal mailbox. Stencil across the side of the metal in crisp, highly reflective white lettering were the words Unit B. I stepped closer, my eyes darting rapidly over the contents spilling out of the large cardboard box on the ground. I felt a cold, furious clarity wash over me as I instantly decoded the true depth of their strategy. This was not a desperate last-minute break-in. This was a highly calculated theatrical set design. Protruding from the top of the box was a sleek black internet modem and a dual-band network router, its power cables still neatly bound with factory zip ties. Next to it sat a small countertop microwave oven, the kind you buy at a big box store to quickly furnish a kitchenette. Stacked carefully beside the appliance were 3 wooden picture frames containing candid photographs of Garrett at a fishing pier and a family barbecue. Tucked underneath the frames was a dark canvas duffel bag unzipped just enough to reveal a stack of freshly laundered men's denim jeans and folded cotton sweaters. They knew that if the corporate inspectors from Seagrass Road Development or a county housing judge walked onto the property on Monday morning, they would look for established signs of a separate functioning dwelling. A standalone mailbox creates a distinct postal registry. An active internet router proves dedicated utility service. Clothes and framed photos manufacture the undeniable illusion of long-term continuous habitation. My father was trying to build a fake life for my brother in the span of 30 minutes. Randall lowered the power drill slowly, his eyes darting frantically between my entirely calm face, Darius's sharp suit, and the imposing uniform of Deputy Miller. In his panic, he fumbled with a thick plastic clipboard tucked under his arm. It slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly against the gravel and scattering several printed sheets of paper across the ground. Darius Flint did not miss a single beat. He stepped forward with the swift predatory grace of a seasoned litigator, smoothly picking up the scattered documents before my father could even bend his knees. Darius held the papers up to the morning light, his eyes scanning the text rapidly. A sharp, incredibly dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. He turned directly to the deputy, completely ignoring my father's trembling presence. "Officer, please observe this evidence carefully," Darius instructed, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable victory. He held up the first sheet. "This is a printed confirmation for a broadband internet installation work order, and the second document is a commercial shipping manifest addressed directly to Garrett Turner, explicitly designating Unit B at this specific geographical address. The third document appears to be a printed state business registry filing attempting to list this residential carriage house as a commercial operating headquarters to establish a live work residency loophole." Darius paused, letting the sheer weight of the fabricated paper trail hang in the air. Then he delivered the killing blow. However, Darius continued, his finger tapping sharply against the bottom corner of the shipping manifest. "If you look right here at the digital timestamp, you will see that these shipping labels and utility work orders were officially generated and printed at exactly 8:45 last night. The ink is barely dry." I turned my head slowly and looked at Garrett. He was standing at the edge of the gravel path, looking as though all the blood had been violently drained from his body. "Your brother," Darius said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal cadence as he addressed me, but made sure the deputy heard every syllable, "just stood on your front porch and aggressively claimed he had a pre-existing long-standing lease. He claimed his personal belongings had been inside this unit for months. Yet his father is standing in an alleyway attempting to screw a mailbox into your siding that still has the hardware store barcode sticker attached to the bottom, holding shipping manifests fabricated precisely 12 hours ago." Garrett was completely paralyzed. The horrifying reality of the situation crashed down upon him. He realized in real time that his father had just taken a very sophisticated, legally ambiguous bluff and transformed it into a blatantly obvious, incredibly stupid act of physical tampering and fraud. The subtle pressure tactic they had meticulously planned had been utterly destroyed by a cordless drill in a cheap metal box. Deputy Miller did not ask for an explanation from Randall. He did not offer my father a chance to spin a lie. The deputy simply reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his heavy agent's-issued smartphone. He activated the camera application and turned on the bright LED flash. The sharp mechanical click of the digital shutter began to echo methodically through the narrow alleyway. The deputy stepped closer, photographing the power drill still clutched in my father's hand. He photographed the painted mailbox. He crouched down and took highly detailed close-up shots of the internet router, the fake framed photographs, the duffel bag of clothes, and the timestamp on the documents Darius was holding. Every single click of that camera was another nail sealing the coffin on their corporate payout. Deputy Miller stood back up, pulling a small black spiral notepad and a ballpoint pen from his shirt pocket. He looked directly at me, his expression entirely businesslike. "Ma'am, for the official incident report," the deputy stated clearly, his pen hovering over the paper. "Have you at any point in time granted Randall Turner or Garrett Turner verbal, written, or implied permission to physically alter the exterior structure of this building, install a separate mail, establish independent utility networks, or store any personal property whatsoever on these premises?" I looked at my father. He looked small, old, and utterly defeated, standing there in the cold morning shadow of the house I owned. "No, deputy," I answered, my voice carrying the steady, immovable weight of the absolute truth. "I have never granted them permission to do anything on my land. They are attempting to manufacture a fraudulent tenancy to steal my home." This clumsy, desperate raid in the back alley had not just saved me from the dangerous trap of a co-resident dispute. It had handed me the ultimate weapon. It transformed their entire scheme from a messy, subjective family argument into a highly documented, undeniable chain of premeditated criminal acts with a specific recorded timeline of preparation. They had brought the police to my house to intimidate me, and I was using those exact same officers to build the ironclad evidence that would bury them permanently. About 20 minutes after Deputy Miller finished logging the physical evidence into his official notebook, a pristine silver luxury sport utility vehicle turned smoothly onto the narrow gravel road behind my property. The heavy door swung open, and my mother, Celeste, stepped out into the crisp, biting morning air. She looked entirely out of place, standing amidst the loose dirt and scattered construction debris of the alleyway. She was dressed with her usual immaculate precision, wearing a tailored charcoal cashmere coat, dark designer sunglasses, and a perfectly knotted silk scarf at her throat. She carried herself with the calm, practiced grace of a woman arriving to gracefully resolve a trivial, embarrassing misunderstanding between overly emotional children. She walked slowly toward the small gathering by the carriage house door. She offered a tight, polite smile to the deputy, completely ignoring the tension radiating from my father and the absolute panic consuming my brother. "Good morning, Officer Peyton." "Darling, what on earth is all this unnecessary commotion?" Celeste asked. Her voice was smooth, melodic, and expertly tuned to project nothing but gentle maternal concern. That I was not listening to her tone. I was watching her eyes as she approached. Her gaze swept quickly over the scene. It passed over the uniformed deputy, brushed past the power drill still resting on the ground, and then, for a fraction of a second, it stopped dead on the newly painted metal mailbox leaning against the cardboard box. She did not gasp. She did not ask what unit B meant. Her eyes simply registered its presence, processed the fact that it had not been successfully attached to the wall, and immediately flicked back to my face. That microscopic silent acknowledgement was everything. It was a full, unvarnished confession. She knew exactly what that mailbox was, and she knew exactly why it was there. Before I could even speak, Darius Flint stepped into her line of sight, holding the forged lease agreement Garrett had tried to use on the front porch. Darius did not offer a polite greeting. He ran his index finger firmly over the raised embossed seal stamped at the bottom right corner of the final page. "I was just reviewing this document, Mrs. Turner," Darius said, his voice carrying a dangerous razor-sharp edge. "It is quite a fascinating piece of fiction. It claims to have been formally executed on the 12th of this month. But what truly catches my attention is the notary public seal authenticating the signature." Darius turned the paper so the deputy could clearly see the stamp. "The registered seal belongs to a woman named Miriam Vance." a very prominent local real estate broker. A cold, heavy stone dropped into the pit of my stomach. Miriam Vance was not just a broker. She was the current treasurer of the coastal country club my parents had belonged to for 2 decades. More importantly, she was Celeste's most consistent Thursday afternoon tennis partner. I had not been in the same room as Miriam Vance in over 7 years. I certainly had never sat across a mahogany desk from her, presented my government identification, and sworn under oath that I was leasing my property to my brother. Celeste had weaponized her own high society friendships. She had convinced a close confidant to commit blatant state notary fraud. She had likely spun a charming, sophisticated lie over expensive lunch salads, claiming the lease was merely a tedious family formality and that her daughter was simply too swamped with corporate work to come down to the office and sign in person. Nora, who had been standing silently near the wooden fence line, observing the entire catastrophic collapse, finally stepped forward. She pulled her thick knitted cardigan tightly around her shoulders and glared at my mother with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. "It all makes terrifying sense now," Nora said, her voice loud enough to echo off the siding of the house. "Last Tuesday, you called my home. You called the Henderson residence 2 doors down, and you called the Miller family across the street. You spent 45 minutes on the phone with me. Celeste, you cheerfully gossiped about how Peyton was feeling utterly burned out by the historic home maintenance. You explicitly told me she was secretly planning to move back up to Raleigh for a logistics promotion before the end of the year, and that she was letting her younger brother use the back studio to keep an eye on the grounds." Nora took a step closer, pointing a rigid finger at my mother's cashmere coat. "You were seeding the neighborhood. You were planting a fabricated narrative. You knew exactly what they were going to do this morning. You set it up so that when a moving truck arrived at dawn, or if Garrett started hauling heavy boxes into the carriage house, none of the neighbors would think to call the police. We would all just smile from our porches, completely believing it was a consensual family transition." As the deputy furiously scribbled Nora's statement into his official incident report, the complete, horrifying architecture of their conspiracy finally crystallized in my mind. Every strange phone call, every passive-aggressive comment, every action over the past 3 weeks snapped together into a flawless, unified blueprint. They had divided the labor of my destruction perfectly. My father was the legal shell. He was the one who called the insurance underwriters, probing for loopholes regarding vacant property clauses and the rights of family members to change locks in an emergency. He was the one who bought the physical hardware, ordered the fake utility connections, and stood in the dirt with a power drill trying to manufacture a physical residency. My brother was the commercial shell. He was the aggressive frontman who slapped my private home address onto a massive corporate pitch portfolio. He had presented himself to Seagrass Road Development as the authorized local broker, promising the executives a clean, unified transfer of the entire land parcel before their Monday morning deadline. But my mother was the social shell. And looking at her now, I realized she was the most insidious, dangerous layer of them all. She was the expensive, glossy varnish painted thickly over a rotting foundation. Their ultimate goal was never just to force me out of my home. The goal was to force me out while keeping their pristine upper-class reputation completely intact. They needed everyone around us to believe that I was the stubborn, irrational villain who was selfishly standing in the way of a logical, mutually beneficial family agreement. I stared at Celeste's perfectly composed face, completely stripping away the maternal title I had given her for my entire life. She did not need to grip a weapon. She did not need to scream threats or kick down doors in the dark. Her power lay in her terrifying ability to make a devastating, life-ruining lie look so effortlessly elegant and so inherently reasonable that the rest of the world felt too polite to ask for the receipts. She built the illusion of consent, and she was entirely willing to use that illusion to leave me with nothing, just to protect her son from his own catastrophic failures. A younger, weaker version of Ton Turner would have shattered right there on the gravel path. I would have screamed until my throat bled. I would have demanded to know how a mother could sit across from me at a holiday dinner, smiling and sipping wine, while actively laying the groundwork to rip away everything I had built. I would have begged for an apology, desperate to find even a single shred of maternal, guilt hiding behind her designer sunglasses. But as I stood in the cold morning light, looking at the complete wreckage of their extortion plot, I felt absolutely zero desire to engage with her emotionally. Tears, shouting, and heartbreak were currencies my mother knew exactly how to manipulate. If I screamed, she would simply lower her voice, tilt her head, and instantly twist the situation into a tragic narrative about my emotional instability. She would smile sympathetically through my anger and walk away looking like the victim of an ungrateful daughter. So I refused to play the game on her terms. I did not raise my voice a single decile. I did not ask her why she did it, because the answer no longer mattered. I simply turned my back to her. I looked away from the elegant facade and turned my complete attention to Darius Flint and Deputy Miller. I handed the entire burden of confrontation over to the cold, unforgiving machinery of the law. I let the fraudulent notary seal, the forged signatures, the recently printed shipping manifests, the live security camera footage, and the sworn police statements do all the talking. Instead of fighting her with my wounded feelings, I buried her in paperwork because hard documented evidence, sworn testimonies, and official criminal reports were the only things in this world that Celeste Turner could not simply smile and sweep under the rug. By exactly 8:00 on Monday morning, the deadline my family had banked their entire financial salvation upon, Darius Flint launched a preemptive legal strike that completely obliterated their timeline. We did not wait for the development company to send their corporate site inspectors to my property. We brought the site to them, wrapped in a massive, undeniable liability warning. Darius dispatched formal, legally binding cease and desist orders via registered courier to every single entity involved in the weekend's disaster. The heavy envelopes landed on the desks of Randall, Celeste, and Garrett. A separate highly detailed notice was hand-delivered to Miriam Vance's real estate brokerage firm, explicitly outlining her fraudulent notarization of the fake lease. Another went directly to the regional utility provider, flagging the unauthorized network installation order placed under a shell corporation. But the most important envelope of all was dropped directly at the corporate headquarters of Seagrass Road Development. The corporate executives at Seagrass Road did not hesitate. Commercial real estate developers operate on a strict diet of clear property titles and zero legal friction. The moment they realized their multi-million-dollar land assembly was being brokered by a man using forged authority and fabricated residency documents, they panicked. They demanded an immediate face-to-face emergency meeting. By noon, we were all sitting inside the freezing glass-walled main conference room at Darius's downtown law firm. It was a stark, sterile environment, a perfect, unforgiving contrast to the warm, vulnerable dining room where this nightmare had started just 4 days prior. My parents and my brother sat on one side of the massive polished granite table. They looked physically exhausted, their expensive clothes completely unable to hide the deep, bruised bags under their eyes and the frantic tension in their shoulders. Across from them sat a senior legal representative from Seagrass Row, a sharply dressed man who looked at Garrett with the kind of absolute disgust usually reserved for a scam artist caught in the act. Darius and I sat at the head of the table. We did not offer coffee or polite pleasantries. Darius simply unclasped his heavy leather briefcase and began building a fortress of irrefutable proof right there on the granite surface. He did not raise his voice. He let the documents scream for him. He laid out the fake eviction notice next to the certified waiver my father had signed years ago. He placed the forged studio lease directly beside the high-resolution photographs Deputy Miller had taken of the newly painted mailbox and the staged luggage in the alleyway. He added the time-stamped internet work order, the printed shell company registry, and the sworn incident report from the local sheriff's department. It was a floorless, suffocating web of evidence. Every single lie they had meticulously crafted was pinned down by a corresponding piece of official documented truth. The Seagrass Row representative leaned forward, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and stared at the spread of documents. He did not ask Garrett for an explanation or offer him a chance to defend himself. He simply folded his hands together and delivered the fatal blow to my brother's grand delusion. "Mr. Turner," the corporate representative said, his tone entirely devoid of any professional courtesy, "your entire broker agreement with our firm was predicated on your explicit written guarantee that you possess the legal authority to deliver this specific parcel of land free and clear of any encumbrances by this morning. It is abundantly clear you hold absolutely zero legal right to this property, effective immediately. Your assembly contract is permanently terminated. You will receive zero compensation. Your broker fee is completely nullified, and our firm is actively exploring civil litigation against you for gross misrepresentation and the squandered costs of our preliminary site surveys. Garrett sank back into his heavy leather chair as if he had been physically struck by a moving vehicle. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The massive life-changing payout he had been desperately chasing, the phantom wealth he had been willing to destroy his own sister to obtain, vanished into thin air right in front of his eyes. Before the oxygen could even return to the room, Darius turned his lethal attention to my father. Furthermore, Darius stated, sliding a thick letter from the title insurance underwriter across the table, because you actively initiated hostile, fraudulent actions against a title you had previously sworn was clear. The escrow reserve funds currently held by the estate are no longer just temporarily frozen. The underwriter has officially petitioned to reallocate those funds. The money you expected to collect will now be systematically drained to cover every single hour of legal defense fees my client has incurred, protecting her property from your coordinated harassment. Randall's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. The financial safety net he thought he had cleverly preserved while simultaneously trying to steal my house was now going to pay the very lawyer actively destroying him. He had quite literally financed his own defeat. It was in that moment of absolute crushing failure that my mother made her final desperate play. Celeste reached across the wide granite table, her perfectly manicured hand hovering just inches from the damning police report. She looked at me, her eyes wide and swimming with manufactured maternal tears. "Please, darling," Celeste whispered, her voice trembling with exactly the right amount of practiced vulnerability. "This has gone entirely too far. We were all just incredibly stressed about the changing neighborhood, and terrible mistakes were made in the heat of the moment. But we are still family. You keep the house. We will step away entirely. Let us just keep this a quiet family arrangement from here on out. We can walk out of this room, pretend this awful weekend never happened, and move forward. There is absolutely no need to push these terrifying legal filings any further into the public record." She wanted a quiet, invisible surrender. She wanted me to sweep the forgery, the extortion, and the police involvement under the rug so she could go back to her country club luncheons without the agonizing shame of a public scandal. She wanted to maintain her glossy, aristocratic veneer, ensuring her social standing remained perfectly intact, even after she had actively conspired to leave me homeless. I looked at her pleading face, feeling completely hollowed out, entirely empty of any residual daughterly affection I might have once harbored. I knew exactly what a quiet agreement meant to people like them. It meant they would retreat, lick their wounds, and simply wait for another vulnerability to exploit years down the line. They did not retreat because they felt genuine remorse or familiar love. They only retreated when a physical or legal wall was slammed directly into their faces. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried a cold, absolute finality that echoed sharply off the glass walls of the conference room. Celeste blinked, her false tears drying up instantly as her expression hardened into genuine, unmasked shock. "We are not keeping anything quiet," I continued, staring directly into my mother's eyes, refusing to let her look away. "We are going all the way to the end of the line. I want formal permanent orders of no trespass filed against all three of you with the county sheriff by the end of the business day. If any of you step foot on my sidewalk, you will be arrested. I want a legally binding, publicly recorded declaration signed by you and your husband stating unequivocally that no member of this family holds any right of possession now or forever to any portion of my real estate." I paused, letting the severity of the demands settle heavily over them before delivering the final condition. "And I am officially authorizing Darius to hand over the complete unredacted file of your fraudulent activities directly to the state regulatory boards regarding the notary seal your friend misused and the commercial business filings Derek falsified." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest as I watched the last traces of arrogance drain from my family. You tried to use the law and forged papers as weapons to destroy my life in the dark. I told them, my voice completely devoid of mercy. Now you are going to live with the permanent, deeply uncomfortable consequences of those actions in the broad daylight. There are no more quiet family arrangements. There is only the public record. The suffocating atmosphere inside the glass-walled conference room had reached its absolute breaking point. Garrett, realizing that his grandmaster plan was disintegrating into a massive corporate lawsuit, did exactly what a man devoid of loyalty always does when cornered. He turned on his own blood. He leaned across the polished granite table, his hands trembling slightly, and looked directly at the Seagrass Road Development representative. In a desperate, pathetic attempt to salvage his lucrative broker fee, my brother entirely threw our father under the proverbial bus. He frantically claimed that Randall had acted completely alone in the physical attempt to breach the carriage house. Garrett swore up and down that he only managed the macro-level commercial land assembly, insisting that even if my specific property was temporarily tied up in a familial dispute, he could still deliver the 3 adjacent abandoned parcels to the development firm to save the project. Randall sat frozen, his jaw locked in silent, humiliated fury as he listened to his only son systematically discard him to save a real estate commission. But before the corporate representative could even respond to Garrett's cowardly pivot, Darius Flint reached into his leather briefcase one last time. He did not pull out a freshly drafted legal motion. He pulled out the very last page from the cardboard overnight envelope that Nora, my fiercely loyal neighbor, had carried onto my front porch on Thanksgiving evening. "Mr. Turner," Darius said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register that instantly silenced my brother's frantic growling. "You cannot deliver the adjacent parcels to Seagrass Row. You cannot assemble a contiguous commercial footprint because you are missing the keystone, and you will never ever possess it." Darius placed the slightly yellowed, heavy stock paper flat on the granite surface. It bore the unmistakable raised seal of a county notary public from many years ago. It was not a document I had drafted. It was a formal, legally recorded addendum authored by my great-aunt Lorraine. I stared at the faded ink of Elraine's signature, a sudden, overwhelming wave of ore washing over me. "This is a legally binding right of first refusal," Darius announced, sliding the document toward the Seagrass Row representative, recorded clearly in the county archives. "It explicitly grants my client Peyton Turner the absolute priority right to purchase the small narrow alleyway lot immediately bordering the rear of her studio apartment. The exact same strip of dirt you purposefully grouped into your master assembly mat to increase your project's total acreage and provide heavy machinery access to the main road." The air in the room vanished. The corporate executive picked up the addendum, his eyes darting rapidly across Lorraine's ironclad legal phrasing. My aunt had known. Even in her final frail years, Lorraine had possessed a terrifyingly clear vision of exactly who my father and my brother truly were. She knew that the moment she was gone, they would smell the rising property values and come circling like vultures. She knew they would try to surround my home, squeeze the property lines, and eventually attempt to force a highly profitable commercial buyout. So she did not just leave me a house. She secretly installed a financial trick wired deep in the county records. She gave me the legal power to permanently block the only viable commercial access route to the surrounding lots. Even if Garrett miraculously managed to buy every single piece of dirt around me, he could never break ground on a massive redevelopment project without my explicit written consent. Lorraine had handed me the master key to their destruction, and she had hidden it in plain sight for years. The Seagrass Row representative did not shout. He simply placed the addendum back onto the table, snapped his leather portfolio shut with a sharp final click, and stood up. "This meeting is concluded," the executive stated, looking at Garrett with an expression of pure, unadulterated corporate contempt. "Seagrass Road Development officially withdraws any and all preliminary proposals regarding this neighborhood footprint. Mr. Turner, you deliberately misrepresented your legal authority and intentionally concealed recorded property encumbrances. Our legal department will be in contact by the end of the week. We will be seeking full financial restitution for every single dollar our firm wasted on site appraisals, surveyor fees, and the billable hours required to untangle your fraudulent mess." He walked out of the glass doors without looking back, taking my family's golden ticket with him. The execution was total. The title agency officially ratified the findings on the record, legally declaring that my father's eviction notice and my brother's fabricated lease were entirely void of any legal standing. Furthermore, the agency used those forged documents as the foundational basis to issue a permanent binding directive. Any future presence of Randall, Celeste, or Garrett Turner on my property lines would instantly be classified as criminal trespass with malicious intent. There was no negotiation. There was no middle ground, and the financial guillotine fell exactly as Darius had promised. The $45,000 escrow reserve that my father had desperately tried to protect was permanently seized. The underwriter released the funds directly to Darius's firm to completely cover the exorbitant legal fees I had incurred defending my title. Every single financial loophole, every dirty trick they had designed to bankrupt and break me had aggressively rebounded and smashed directly into their own bank accounts. I looked across the table at my mother. For my entire life, Celeste Turner had possessed an uncanny, terrifying ability to talk her way out of any consequence. She could always spin a narrative, soften a blow, and rewrite history to make herself look like the elegant, misunderstood peacemaker. But as she sat in that freezing conference room, surrounded by cancelled contracts, fraud investigations, and the smoking ruins of her family's reputation, she was entirely mute. She did not bring up the concept of family fairness. She did not try to offer a polite, condescending smile. For the very first time in her pristine, highly curated life, she was trapped in a room with a harsh documented reality that she could not simply edit with a clever lie. The paper trail was an absolute brick wall, and it had finally shattered her porcelain mask. We left them sitting there in the silence of their own making. Exactly 3 weeks later, on a crisp, bright Tuesday morning, I walked into the county clerk's office downtown. I sat across from a pleasant administrative worker, handed over a certified bank draft, and formally executed L. Rain's addendum. I purchased the narrow dirt alleyway behind my studio for exactly the fair market value assessed a decade ago. It was a modest sum, but it was the most satisfying check I had ever written in my entire life. With that single transaction, I dropped a permanent, unbreakable padlock onto the neighborhood. I locked out the commercial developers, and I permanently buried the greedy, parasitic dream my brother had tried to build on my back. That evening I returned to my quiet, beautifully restored riverside home. The air inside was completely still, smelling faintly of the wood fire I had burned the night before. I walked down the long hallway and stepped into the dining room. I stood next to the heavy mahogany table. I looked at the exact spot next to the center placement where my father had slid that cream-colored envelope across the wood on Thanksgiving, fully expecting me to shatter under the weight of his authority. I pulled out one of the antique chairs and sat down alone in the quiet house. I rested my hands on the smooth polished wood. I thought about the years of exhaustion, the calloused hands, and the sheer terror of the past few weeks. And then I thought about Lorraine. I finally understood the magnitude of what that stubborn, brilliant old woman had done for me. She did not just leave me a piece of historic real estate with a repaired roof and updated wiring. She knew the storms that would eventually come for me, and she knew they would not be made of wind and rain. They would be made of blood and greed. Lorraine left me a structure strong enough both physically and legally to survive the absolute worst of my own family. And as I sat in the peaceful silence of the home that was now undeniably eternally mine, I knew I had honored her blueprint perfectly. Thank you so much for listening to my story until the very end. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So, please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts on this crazy situation. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, leave a like on this video, and support the channel even more by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by as many people as possible. Thanks to all.